We do not have to fight a political battle per se. We do not have to build parties in first instance. No, what we have to do is fight a meta-political battle. We have to fight a battle for ideas. My latest essay, my apologies for people watching from abroad only in Dutch for the moment, is all about the idea of the contemporary anti-Enlightenment tradition. The fact that in the 21st century, we see all these old ideas reappearing again, and in many cases in a new package. So you would find people advocating hardcore nationalism, from ethno-cultural nationalism to the old school blood and soil nationalism, but wrap it in a new package, a package of democracy, of enlightenment and so on. But it's reappearing again, and we see it in Trump, but we also see it in the alt-right movement. We see it in the identitarian movements all over Europe. We see it in political parties in power, like in my country, the New Flemish Alliance, and they're really harvesting what is called a meta-political battle that started somewhere in the 60s of the last century. I have to remind some people, we are talking after the Second World War. We have a general consensus again that democracy is a good thing, that universal human rights are worth fighting for. You get the Declaration of Human Rights and so on. And on the right at that time, and the fringe right in particular, you have the general idea like the left is winning. The left is not only in power, but the left now is able to create normality. They have hegemony. You would find people like Alain de Benoit, Guillaume de Faye, Dominique Venner in the 60s looking at May 68 and what happened in the civil rights movement in the United States, the changes in the Democratic Party there, and saying like we have to learn from the left, and more in particular we have to learn from one of the main theorists of the left, Gramsci. We do not have to fight a political battle per se. We do not have to build parties in first instance. No, what we have to do is fight a meta-political battle. We have to fight a battle for ideas and make sure that our ideas are becoming normal again. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by setting up journals, scientific conferences, in the 90s, websites and so on. And you would find that they take great effort of translating topics and so on, and building a pan-European movement. And these fringe groups have impact. So throughout the 90s, you would see that, especially on the topic around integration, migration, remember it's the time super diversity comes into being, and on the right you see a reaction against that with an anti-migration agenda, an integration agenda, and within these, especially within that field of political debate, you see reappearance of all these old ideas, but now under the flag of democracy. And on the right, you'll have these anti-Enlightenment thinkers now in full force, globally connected in many cases, very well embedded within the new internet and so on, using these tactics and fighting that battle. The battle against Enlightenment is more than 2 centuries old, but if we listen to contemporary debates on politics of politicians and intellectuals, we see that Enlightenment is a constantly reoccurring topic. And in many cases, we see that Enlightenment is used in a very specific and very new way. Enlightenment as a definition of who we are, a definition of our identity, what we stand for. And in that definition, something happens to Enlightenment, and maybe that's why it's relevant to look at Enlightenment even today, because it says something about the larger tradition in which politicians today talk. And in a lot of work that I have been doing, I focus on Enlightenment, and very specific on one type of Enlightenment called radical Enlightenment. a concept introduced by Jonathan Israel in a series of books on enlightenment, in which he makes the claim that if we think about enlightenment in connection to democracy, in connection to inalienable rights, in connection to representation, universal human rights, and so on, we can only talk about a very specific type of enlightenment, radical enlightenment. And this is the curious thing. If we think about radical enlightenment, we think about people like Diderot and D'Alembert, Condorcet, Paine, Price, Priestley, all these names that nobody ever refers to. And that's interesting. And the reason why is that radical enlightenment and moderate enlightenment are two separate movements within a larger time frame at the time. But if you look at these radical enlightenment thinkers, you see that they are anti-racists, that they are feminists, that they're anti-colonial, anti-slavery. And most of that literature is very contemporary, even today. Even more, we can see it as a criticism on what most politicians today are doing and saying. And this is the interesting distinction you have. Enlightenment is always present, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we see that if we look to these contemporary discourses on enlightenment from a radical enlightenment point of view, if we look at the texts of the philosophers and we connect them to the politicians, we see a world apart. What is the relevance now of enlightenment and anti-enlightenment? Well, a thorough understanding of enlightenment and anti-enlightenment allows us to understand contemporary political issues within a much larger time frame. And let us now look at the discussion that erupts all over the world now around the Global Compact for Migration from the United Nations, a compact that has to be signed somewhere around the 10th and the 11th of December, symbolically, of course, hugely important, the 70-year birthday of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And what we see happening is that the United States, under Trump, left the agreement a long time ago. If we look at my country, we see that the Secretary of State for Migration, Theo Franke from Nationalist Party, refuses to sign. We see that in the Netherlands, somebody like Thierry Baudet, for instance, is speaking in Parliament, and he's truly and very explicitly targeting human rights. Explicitly. We see it in UKIP, we see it with Le Pen and so on. And here you see the relevance, of course. Radical enlightenment, not enlightenment, but radical enlightenment is where the general idea was born that people have inalienable rights. Why? Because they're humans. Not because they're citizens of a certain nation. No. If you're a human, you should have these rights. And that global compact is far from perfect in any way, but at least one thing is positioned there, namely that a migrant, even though there are legal migrants, illegal migrants, recognized or not, that they have human rights. And that whenever they arrive in a certain country, the bare minimum is that human right. And what you see today is that nationalists all over the world target that idea. And this is hugely relevant, of course, because that has been a long time. Democracy, universal rights, and so on, most politicians would pay lip service to that. This is what defines us, and this is our identity. This is the West way of doing. We call ourselves superior, holding the Enlightenment flag. But when it comes to concrete practices, when it comes to politics for real, we see that most of these parties are targeting that idea. And in the last 3-4 decades, we see that becoming far more explicit. And here you see again the relevance, of course. What we see happening today is that under the democratic and Enlightenment flag, we see a whole new or a very old tradition reappearing again, a tradition that somebody like Zeev Sternhill would call an anti-Enlightenment tradition. We see that they do that and use the idea of the nation. we have to stick up for the nation, and we have to stick up for the borders of that nation. We have to fight for our identity, for our values, because the other, the migrant, is always being portrayed as an attack on that nation, on the fiber, the costly fiber of that nation. We see very old theories reappearing again. We see Spengler again becoming popular. We see Carl Schmitt reappearing as a very interesting and edgy thinker. And we see all these radical anti-Enlightenment ideologies reappearing today as normal things, as being realistic. If we start thinking about Enlightenment and the battle against Enlightenment, that there's not only a battle that wants to go back to the ancien regime, that wants to go back to the old structures. No. From the start of Enlightenment, especially from the French Revolution onwards, what you would see is a whole range of politicians, intellectuals, thinkers that would target Enlightenment and that would not wanting to go back, but wanting to construct a second modernity, a modernity that is not built on the idea of universal human rights, on principles of equality and freedom, on solidarity and so on, but one in which the nation becomes of key importance. And the nation there is being envisioned as a costly fiber, as an organism that works in itself, that lives, and that is more than the combination of all the individuals making up the nation. The nation becomes an entity, an organism that can go sick and that has to be cared for and so on. And caring for is meaning maintaining traditions, values, norms, the culture, the identity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the structures of the state. The start of that tradition starts with Vico Giambattista, a long time before Edmund Burke. But Edmund Burke is a key figure that truly attacks the French Revolution in his reflections on the revolution in France, and he does that by putting English nationalism at the core. You have to cherish traditions, you have to cherish inequality, you have to cherish the king. Inequality is a good thing, is the normal, natural state of affairs, and that should be cherished, because if you start changing all these things, everything will break down. The costly fiber will go down. The organism will eventually die. And that way of thinking that you would also find in Herder and later on in famous intellectuals like Taine and Spengler and Carl Schmitt and so on, that would be an enormous influential fundament for the attack on Enlightenment values, and later especially socialism, communism and feminism. All these ideologies are seen as ideologies, as revolutionary ideologies, and thus as attacks on the nation, on the natural state of affairs, and that can only erupt in chaos, in decadence, in drama and so on. These ideas, we see them reappearing today. The nation is key. The moment you put the nation before the individual, you see immediately how they target the idea of universal human individual rights. But on the other hand, it targets the general idea of working towards a global political order. So one of the criticisms, again, on that global compact, for instance, is the global cooperation. We envision migration as a global problem, and thus it needs global attention. We need global cooperation. And within that anti-Enlightenment tradition, everything supranational was seen as a problem. That was the case in the 30s. If you would read Spengler and Schmitt, they would target the Volkerenbond, the People's Union at the time, the predecessor of the United Nations. Why? Because it's telling things that should be done to the nation. For radical Enlightenment thinkers, democracy was representation and human rights. Democracy was always envisioned as an instrument to realize universal human rights. And democracy, in that sense, was also a step up. It was a way of creating bigger wholes, the nation as an upscaling of democracy. And the envision was a general revolution. Thomas Paine, Condorcet, they all dreamt of what they would call a happy democratic revolution. Today we see that democracy in story is being used against human rights. And this is a key difference, of course, and it's one that we see happening constantly. And in effect, it's not about democracy, it's about the nation state. And that nation state is envisioned as an ethno-cultural homogenic whole. It's about us as true Belgians, as true Finns, as true Dutchmen, as true Englishmen. And these migrants do not belong here. And that is the true reasoning behind these discourses. To look at it as a discursive battle for meaning, as a battle between an endless debate, to use the words of Lefort, in which you construct and try to push something as being normal. So creating normality and making certain ideas, values acceptable and normal, understood as fact, is, I think, at the heart of politics. And so if you have to understand our contemporary era, we have to understand that it's constructed through an endless discursive battle of meaning between different actors in society. And today we see the right has understood this immensely. So if you look at the new right, you'll see that they have done nothing else. It started with Alain de Benoit in journals and so on, but you would find it now in hashtags, in algorithmic activism, in websites that are being set up, movies that are being launched, memes that are being used to create normality. If you understand this as one of the key things of politics, then you know that it will never happen by coincidence. We will not, by coincidence, enter in a world that is truly democratic. It will not be by coincidence that we find a world in which human rights are truly universal and that everyone's human rights is truly respected, but that you also have the infrastructures that make sure that you can guarantee those human rights. This is the essence of the fight that is going on. And what we see right now is that the right is upscaling that. So the UKIP battle and the one of Thierry Baudet and the New Flemish Alliance and Trump and so on, you'll see connections and network effects happening all over the place. I did one analysis of a fringe group in Flanders, Gilte en Vrienden, that if you analyze the likes and the shares of their posts, you'll see that it's people all over the world. And most of these people cannot even read and understand the post that they are sharing and liking. No, they do it because they think it's politically important to support that. And you would see people from the United States running for Congress, Republicans, but red-pilled far-right Republicans, sharing those posts. You would find Boers from South Africa sharing those posts, UKIP members, true fascists, and so on. And so here you see an understanding of politics in the sense of metapolitics, or in the Gramscian sense, a fight for hegemony. Normalize certain ideas and make sure that your post is traveling as if it has popular support. So if you now have to look at the other side, left-wing and more broader, just Democrats in general, you see that many of them are just doing the party political thing. I'm a member of a party and I'm electable and so on. But what we need is far more than that. We need true social movements, again, that connect network and hierarchical structures. And that is, I think, the big challenge for the next decade or so, is that we try to find a way in which traditional civil society actors, like unions, for instance, are able to connect to more networked-based organizations that work around a certain topic and so on, but that fight it on the long term. And I think the long term is key here. We have to envision again an image of a good society. We are in an unstable world. We are in a world that is changing to something new, to something post-capitalist. But what world that will come afterwards? Highly insecure. So the Marxist determinist thing that socialism will inevitably come after capitalism, we say, well, this is not the case. We have to envision the world that will come. And in essence, you could envision a world in which we all have to work less. We can envision a world in which everybody would have human rights. In essence, all things are in place so that everybody would have food and enough food. We could produce enough stuff that answer the basic needs of human people. It's all there. We have the wealth, we have the possibilities, we have the technological know-how. But of course, we are in a system that does not allow that things to happen. And again, we are here with the 1%, of course. If you are an elite and you have 70 different companies all over the world, and you have more than $1 billion on your bank account, you're not maybe so happy that somebody would say, well, we're going to tax that on 75% because we want to redistribute wealth. And you will have people with money thinking it's not a good idea to have a more equal system because it means that their privileges will be targeted. And if you're Amazon and all of a sudden all over the world you have to produce and pay your employees a good wage, and you have to pay social security and so on, maybe you're just in the end somebody like all of us that has money and enough money and good health care and education, but you cannot buy 70 different Ferraris, 70 different houses and so on, and people resist against that. And that has always been the case. In the end, it's all about power.